Hello, good evening everyone. How delightful to see you all here in such numbers. My name is Misha Glennie. I'm the rector of the Institute for Human Sciences, the IWM, EVM, and we are here for our third keynote speech of the Vienna Humanities Festival, the 8th Vienna Humanities Festival. I'm not going to bore you for too long. I just want you to know that from tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock, we will be having 21 conversations with intellectuals, artists, academics, journalists from all over the world. And they are going to be extremely interesting. So if you don't have anything compelling to do over the weekend, I suggest you make your way to the Academy of Fine Arts on Schillerplatz and feed your mind, as it were. And let me not forget the fourth keynote speech tomorrow evening at the Volkstheater with the French sociologist Didier Eribon. I do believe it's sold out, but invariably, just before the show starts, tickets come free. So get down there, be there or be square, as they say. And without further ado, I would like to introduce the director of the Wien Museum, Matti Bunzel, who is going to introduce tonight's speaker and be in conversation with her later on. Matti.
Thank you so much. Welcome to the Wien Museum. It's wonderful to see so many of you here, and I feel inspired because that was such a rousing introduction. It's almost impossible to imagine, but if someone here is not signed up for our newsletter, I urge you to do that, because on Wednesday and today it's the Vienna Humanities Festival, but we have tons of wonderful events here with great speakers, often in partnership with the EVM and other great organizations. So if you're curious, at our website, wienmuseum.at, right below the calendar, you can sign up. Okay, on to tonight's entertainment. This is actually a highly serious talk. So I think we're trying to make a little light before we think about sovereignty and positivist legal philosophy and stuff like that. Natasha Wheatley is a scholar of modern and international history with interests in intellectual and legal history, Central Europe, and international law. She is associate professor of history at Princeton University. She's the co-editor of Remaking Central Europe, the League of Nations, and the former Habsburg lands and power, as well as power and time, temporalities in conflict and the making of history. She is renowned for a book that has only been out for about 2 years, but it's been a smash in the field, not just of Austrian and Habsburg history, but I think legal history. And it is titled, you can also buy it outside, The Life and Death of States, Central Europe, and a Transformation of Modern Sovereignty. And I'm very intrigued because from the book, Transformation of Modern Sovereignty, we're going to the birth of modern sovereignty tonight. So I'm intrigued to see yet another extension of temporality in practice. Please join me in welcoming Natasha Wheatley to the stage of the Vienna Humanities Festival. After the talk, we'll have a brief conversation, and then the evening will continue at the cafe. We're trying to have a salon here, so please join us for that as well.
It is such a pleasure to be here this evening. This is a city I love, and it's a particular pleasure to be here talking about my book, which really serves as a bit of an archive of the experiences I had over many years living here while I was working on it. I owe much to many Austrian mentors, colleagues, friends, archivists, librarians, but also to the venerable waiters at the Café Engländer, where I spent many evenings with a glass of wine after the Nationalbibliothek had closed, sort of gradually making my way back home to the Zweiten Bezirk, where I was living at the time. I'm especially grateful to Desi Gavrilova for the wonderful invitation, and indeed to the whole team behind this incredible festival. You're doing such extraordinary things. As well as to Misha Glennie, of course, and to Matti Bunzel for this very warm welcome here. It's such a pleasure to be engaged with you all. So, with some audacity, I realize, I stand before you this evening on stage in Vienna with the hope of presenting some new ways of thinking about the Habsburg Empire. Now, we are all familiar with the Habsburg Empire of the world of arts and letters in popular memory. This is the nostalgic, tragicomic Danube monarchy of Joseph Roth and Robert Musil, and more recently, Wes Anderson's Grand Budapest Hotel, where towers of pastel cake boxes teeter precariously in bicycle baskets rattling along cobblestone streets. For all its charm and cultural richness, this version of the Habsburg Empire is almost predicated on the empire's political unseriousness. As Musil quipped in his Mann ohne Eigenschaften, ruinous sums of money were spent on the army, but only just enough to secure its position as second weakest among the great powers. My book, in contrast, places the Habsburg Empire at the center of something very serious indeed, although not without its ironies, namely the transformation of a world of multinational empires to a world of nation-states, a transformation that must count as one of the most significant developments in modern history. If international historians have written hundreds and hundreds of monographs on this subject, they have dwelt disproportionately on the British and the French empires, often presenting the history of these imperial formations as synonymous with the story of modern statehood itself. The Habsburg historians, meanwhile, have focused on other more internal issues, two in particular. First, the reasons for the empire's collapse, with shifting appraisals of weakness and strength, modernity and backwardness. And secondly, the nature of the nationalisms that ostensibly brought it down, from ancient ethnic enmity to national indifference, in the important keyword of the historian Tara Zara. Vital as many of these questions remain, my book returns to Habsburg Central Europe with a set of more outward-facing questions about the legal and intellectual history of empire, sovereignty, and statehood, presenting a new story about the empire as crucible of our contemporary world order. So in the first half of my remarks tonight, I'm going to lay out some of the big ideas, approaches, and arguments of the book, before returning in the second half to put a little more empirical meat on those conceptual bones. So please come with me in the first instance into this world of ideas, and don't be too put off if it's a little bit abstract at the beginning. I hope by the end you'll see the larger whole I'm trying to reconstruct. Okay, so we can start on the same page together. What are the sort of major stories that historians tell, the meta-narratives, if you will, about the modern state? There are two really big ones in particular. First, historians like to talk about the emergence of the modern state out of a welter of overlapping orders and jurisdictions, right? Out of a messier world of lords and vassals and estates, all wielding competing forms of right and engaged in forms of rule that were not necessarily understood in territorial terms, but rather as porous and socially embedded relationships. They talk about the emergence of the idea of sovereignty as a single and highest power, presiding instead over uniform, legally homogeneous territory with a monopoly on legitimate force. So we could call this the centralization or the consolidation narrative, in which states become emphatically territorialized entities with powerful new capacities. Then, to take the second major story about the modern state, historians like to talk about the globalization of the state form, right? Because as late as the 19th century, the world was populated by a wild variety of sorts of polities, right? They ranged from huge, globe-spanning, industrialized empires to all kinds of smaller formations, including polycentric sultanates and indigenous communities living according to their own law. Today, by contrast, we look out over a globe almost entirely segmented into sovereign states, or would-be states, modular, clearly demarcated, theoretically equal under international law. Driving this transformation was, of course, decolonization, as anti-colonial revolutionaries overthrew imperial rule and founded scores of new states, especially in Asia and Africa in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So there are these two big stories, and my book revisits them both from the somewhat unexpected place of the Habsburg Empire. It does so along three central avenues. It begins in the aftermath of the European revolutions of 1848, which I understand many of you may have got an introduction to last year with Chris Clark's lecture here. So in the wake of these revolutions, as you will know, the Habsburg Empire was convulsed by decades of constitutional experimentation in the face of rising provincial demands for political rights, right? This is the phase in which the empire cycles through a dizzying number of constitutional orders in the late 40s and then in the 60s. So I show first how these structural experiments in imperial organization directly tackled a set of transitions usually deemed constitutive of the modern state, especially the transition from private patrimonial rule to abstract public authority, and from pluralist, differentiated legal orders to singular, uniform, unified ones. Now, the Habsburg Empire, and this is very important, is especially revelatory for this story because of certain key structural attributes of the empire, okay? Unlike in France, no revolution had swept away all the old rights and legalities of the Ancien Regime. The full complex of dynastic patrimonial law needed to be argued over and converted manually into modern equivalents. Unlike in Britain, which also didn't have a revolution, of course, the Habsburg government had been forced into a written constitution, meaning these adaptations could not unfold backstage, gradually, fuzzily, absent-mindedly. The empire's legal order had to be publicly articulated. And, unlike Germany, the empire's rulers and thinkers could not appeal to the ostensibly organic, natural or national unity of das Volk, right, to ground the unity of the state, as the dominant historical school of law did there. Its increasingly volatile multiplicity of peoples made that proposition absurd, right? And the Habsburg legal thinkers are quite funny about this, right? If a law was supposed to be grounded in the Volkstheater, as the Germans said, what did that mean here? Were there 9, 10, 11, 12 Volkstheater, and how is this supposed to ground public order? No, the Habsburg monarchy would have to chart an alternate path into sovereign modernity, to think its way towards different theories capable of anchoring public order in an age disenchanted with gods and kings. Combined, these characteristics turned the Habsburg lands into a remarkably explicit workshop for the attempted production of abstract, singular sovereignty out of multinational dynastic composite empire. Right? The case allows us to eavesdrop on the refashioning of the body of the king to the body politic, replete with its unresolved problems and inconsistencies, its myths, its imaginative leaps, and its many significant consequences. Second, I recover the place of the Habsburg Empire in that other foundational process underpinning the emergence of a world of states, that is, the demise of formal empire and the rise of the nation-state in its wake. Now, we rightly associate this story with the decolonization of Asia and Africa in the decades that followed the Second World War. But certain parts of the story crystallized at the end of the previous World War with the dissolution of Habsburg rule in Central Europe. Under the watchful eye of the international community, assembled first at the Paris Peace Conference and then as the League of Nations, a string of newborn sovereign powers appeared in the empire's place, as you all know well, including Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Austria, and Yugoslavia. Now, important substantive differences distinguish this chapter of imperial dissolution from the one that followed the next World War. The post-imperial is not the same as the post-colonial. But the end of Habsburg rule raised legal questions about the nature of post-imperial sovereignty that would remain persistent features of the subsequent global history of decolonization. Here, too, the Habsburg monarchy occupied a distinct place, again, had very interesting structural characteristics that distinguished it from the cohort of empires, Ottoman, Russian, and German, that collapsed at the war's end at the same time as it did, because the whole of its former territory was converted into newly independent states, right? That's not what happened in the other cases, right? The Ottoman territories in the Middle East become mandate territories, and so the question of post-imperial sovereignty is really a post-Habsburg problem in this period. So legal conundrums surrounding the messy end of empire and the creation of new states, especially things like the succession of rights, obligations and territories, right, of continuous and discontinuous sovereignty, were thrown onto the main stage of 20th century international order, largely by the implosion of Habsburg rule. The legal stories and theories developed to make sense of that huge rupture and that transition would echo in subsequent decades through South Asia, Africa, and beyond, as I'll tell you a little bit about. But there's a third reason that anyone interested in the history of modern sovereignty needs to look very closely right here. And that is that legal thinkers from this corner of the world exercised a radically outsized influence on the evolution of modern legal philosophy in general, and in theories of the state in particular. To a startling degree, ideas that shape our discourses about sovereignty right through to the present were born in the Habsburg lands in the decades before and after the empire's collapse. A state, according to international law's standard codification, comprises four things: an effective government, a clearly defined territory, a stable population, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. The original architect of that test was Georg Jelinek, son of Vienna's most famous rabbi. Across a prolific career, which culminated in a chair in Heidelberg, where he was a close interlocutor of Max Weber after anti-Semitism drove him from Vienna, Jelinek forged many of the disciplinary building blocks of public and international law. He also inaugurated a methodological revolution that would bear spectacular fruit in the work of his student Hans Kelsen. One of the 20th century's most important legal philosophers, Kelsen was also a product of the Habsburg experience. He studied when the empire was at its apogee and taught at the University of Vienna as it came crashing down. He masterminded Austria's post-war constitution and served as a judge on its constitutional court before anti-Semitism caught up with him too. The political storms of interwar Europe tossed him first to Cologne and a legendary confrontation with Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt, then to Geneva, and eventually to Berkeley. He escaped Europe aboard the SS Washington as Hitler's armies marched on Paris. Along the way, he developed an extraordinarily complete philosophy of law, known as the pure theory of law. Its analytical insight, explanatory power, and global influence are matched only by its degree of difficulty and the degree of controversy it generated. Integral to its architecture was a radical new account of what the state was. It explained how law could turn a messy, contradictory reality into a singular, unified legal order. It sprang from that quintessential Habsburg dilemma and perhaps quintessential Habsburg alchemy, that is, how to spin multiplicity into some sort of unity. Then, as the empire collapsed and he and his collaborators reckoned with the birth and death of states, they were pushed towards a radical new account of the relationship between sovereignty and international law. So my book explains those ideas and their significance and shows why it was not an accident that they emerged in the Habsburg lands. The empire became such a hothouse of legal innovation in both academic theory and constitutional practice, precisely because existing theories could not make sense of it. To confront questions of state and sovereignty in this intricately layered, prodigiously complex empire was to confront the radical limit of legal concepts and to be propelled, driven towards new ones. So it might be ironic that an empire saturated with historical rights and traditional law birthed the most strident apostles of legal modernism, but it is not inexplicable. On the contrary, the book shows how orders of thought evolved in dynamic tension with orders of rule, and why innovation and anachronism proved such intimate associates rather than each other's opposites. If the book places a spotlight on Jelinek and Kelsen, both mainstays of law school histories and textbooks, but conspicuously neglected by historians, it also offers a broader contextual explanation for the many other thinkers from the Habsburg Empire who shaped 20th century legal history, including Eugen Ehrlich, a pioneering scholar of legal pluralism, in vogue again, as well as Herr Schlautepacht, giant of mid-century international law. Right? Law was an existential matter in these lands, and that shows, I think, in the quality of thinkers it produced. So the book thus presents the intellectual history of sovereignty not as the history of an idea, but as an attempt to make sense, right? As a form of sense-seeking, a reach for ideas and methods that could explain or really construct the coherence and legitimacy of the state, right? Without recourse to those other sorts of answers that you had elsewhere. Which brings us to the philosophical and conceptual problems that lie at its heart. Because although it's a work of history, it's very much in conversation with philosophers and political theorists too, and with sort of questions of theory more broadly. So I'm especially interested in two pivotal legal fictions that still animate our legal systems today. So I don't know if you're familiar with this term, legal fictions. You know, legal fiction is just that which the law presumes, right, in order to function. And so these are these sorts of mythic constructions. They're sort of terms of art, but actually legal systems are full of them. This sort of storytelling, if you will, these presuppositions that you have to have in order for law to continue. So one of them, for example, is like the reasonable man, right, is a classic one in many areas of law that you presume in order to reason. But I'm talking here about some very large legal fictions to do with public law. And the two that I'm most interested in are the idea of sovereign singularity, the singleness or the unitariness of the state, and sovereign immortality. That is the idea that the state is one continuous legal entity through time, right? The idea that although all of you will sadly one day pass away, Austria will continue, right, as this legal entity unchanged, that somehow this overarching legal unit survives the change of all its members. Right, so both these fictions proved especially difficult in the Habsburg lands, allowing us to crack open their histories and the fantasies, fears, and epistemologies they involved. So, first, its singularity. Classically, the major theorists of sovereignty, right, people like Thomas Hobbes, Baudin, Rousseau, had placed the singularity of sovereignty, the notion of a single, supreme, undivided power, at the very core of their definitions of what sovereignty was. But the view from the Habsburg lands made one skeptical about these ideas. Georg Jelinek, our rabbi's son, confronted them head on, arguing that these classical theories simply could not make sense of sovereignty in Central Europe. Whether one looked at Austria-Hungary or Imperial Germany or Switzerland, one confronted polities marked by varieties of amalgamation or disaggregation. As a result, legal theory judged these polities irregular or abnormal or provisional or simply incomprehensible. But Jelinek had a different diagnosis of the problem. All these thinkers, he said, they came from England and France. They reasoned from Western European experiences and presumed them universal norms. But what if the theory, and not the irregular state, was to blame for the resulting incongruity? Why could some sorts of states generate models and be abstracted into theories, and not others? Jelinek set out to correct matters, devising notions of sovereignty that began with plurality rather than singularity, and placed imperial configurations at the center. Because that's the other sort of irony, right, about British and French state theory. These are polities that are having these huge empires, but the empires sort of don't figure in the theorization of these polities. A generation later, Kelsen confronted the same problem, but took a different path, out-theorizing the theorists to offer a blisteringly sophisticated but prodigiously abstract new philosophy of law. Surveying the messy, pluralistic world around him, a bricolage of polities and peoples, he felt sure that the ultimate source of the state's legitimacy and coherence could not be deduced from this chaotic material reality. Trying to do that would drive you crazy. Thus, the hot new approaches coming out of psychology and sociology were mistaken in their presumption that the state's foundations could be anchored in empirical phenomena. He turned from materialism to logical philosophy, to epistemology, Erkenntniskritik. His theory turned on the idea of a single ultimate basic norm or Grundnorm, an original norm from which all other norms flowed. Now, he was quite clear that this existed nowhere in the material world. There one saw only clashing forces and volatile alliances. It was a purely hypothetical proposition, a formal rule about the possibility of rules themselves that was implied or presupposed every time a judge or a jurist presumed there was such a thing as valid law. Right? He says every time someone makes a legal argument that they presume law is possible, and what is the basis of that? It can only be this original leap into law, this original basic norm. So it was not material, but it was not imaginary either. It was present in the empirical world as a logical presupposition for all legal thought. In this basic norm, and in the basic norm alone, lay the singularity of the state. With high modernist pathos, he tried to ground the ultimate coherence, unity, and legitimacy of the legal order without recourse to gods or kings or natural right or material power or nations or class or any other essentialism, but in logical inference alone, right? It's in this we can see the particularly Habsburg characteristics of this philosophy, because there was no essentialized there in which you could base the law of the state, right? You had to come up with something abstract that everyone could participate in equally. The pure theory's crystalline propositions made it eminently portable. It was quickly translated and deployed all around the globe. Yet its very abstraction, I argue, stands as an unmarked archive of the Habsburg experience. The pure theory's sky-high philosophy existed in inverse proportion to the detailed complexity of that which needed to be solved. One had to rise so far above the ground to order that chaos into cosmos. So the second major fiction is the idea of the immortality of the state. So as I said, the notion that the state remains the same unchanging legal entity despite the coming and going of governments, constitutions, indeed all of us. Juridical immortality can be traced back to foundational early modern theories of sovereignty. It responded to concrete needs and objectives. Unless the state persisted, despite the death of a monarch or the fall of a regime, it could not guarantee the intergenerational continuity of public order, rights, duties. In Thomas Hobbes's phrase, the state required an artificial eternity of life. And Kantorowicz famously recovered the idea of the idea's medieval origins in the doctrine of the king's two bodies, one fleshed and mortal, the other understood as abstract and perpetual. But this is no mere dusty scholasticism. The state's juridical agelessness, the stable continuity of its legal self through the flow of time, remains a crucial enabling fiction for our systems of law, facilitating everything from state treaties to public debt. One prominent international lawyer, James Crawford, recently called the state an intergenerational transition mechanism, as though it were a portal connecting us to those long dead and those still unborn. So if historians of political thought have lavished attention on the idea of state immortality as it emerged in the early modern and medieval and early modern periods, no one seems to have wondered about the fate and meaning of this doctrine in the modern period, in an era of imperial upheaval and collapse that could not but put huge pressure on the background assumption of sovereign perpetuity. And picking up that question, The Life and Death of States offers something like a history of ahistorical things. It pursues the historical life of entities, that is, states, that claim to be immune to time's passing. It presents legal perpetuity as something actively made, desired, and doubted by historical actors, and analyzes the intellectual scaffolding that that continuity required. At the center of this book, then, lies an interest in the historical production of abstraction, an interest in attempts to escape the movement of history itself. So as one debated the empire's order and then reckoned with its collapse, both these fictions came under extraordinary pressure. Though myriad politicians and scholars strained and struggled to make sense of it all, the particularities of the Habsburg land pushed all theories of sovereignty to their breaking point. So rather than take sovereignty as an idea or a thing, I present it as a problem, a stimulus, eliciting ever new attempts to solve, to theorize, to understand, and to order. Each new constitutional configuration, like each academic theory, struggled to contain or tame its object, never quite finding coherence or fixing meaning, never quite achieving political and intellectual stability. So in recovering that history, I'm attentive to the affective desire for order and logical coherence, right? There's something like a bit of an anthropology of scholarship here, and then the experience of its elusiveness, treating these things not as some sort of incidental backstage to a real history of law and ideas, but as the main stage of the story itself. So the life and death of states is an intellectual history of theory not working, an intellectual history of not having the words. Okay, so let's back up and put some more flesh on this story. So I don't need to tell you all what the empire looks like, but this map is very useful in other contexts. So as you know, the Habsburg Empire was a fascinating bricolage polity composed of multiple different lands. It was sort of a time capsule of European history in which different phases of state formation remained alive in the present. Its formal legal architecture preserved the logic of its medieval and early modern formation through a series of dynastic unions. On paper, it remained a concatenation of myriad distinct polities that were united only through a shared monarch, in what historians would later call composite monarchy. In the era of enlightened absolutism, of course, this legal structure had been overlaid, but not dissolved, with robust organs of centralized government based in Vienna. The 19th century added yet another layer as national movements emerged among the empire's language communities and demanded a place in the empire's political architecture. So the empire, I want to suggest, was many versions of itself at once, a layer cake of sovereign history. What was a state? Here was the place to find out, or at least to ask. When one tried to square the empire with the category state, numerous plausible interpretations emerged, all of them contradictory. Only two things were certain, reflected one law professor. First, it truly was a monarchy. Second, it was not a simple unified polity, but rather a plural compound one. Everything else, he wrote, is doubtful or at least contested. In particular, how many states does it consist of? What are they called? What is their legal relationship to one another? Was the Habsburg monarchy one state, two state, three states, four? In recent decades, a stream of important scholarship by Tara Zara, Peter Judson, Kate Brown and others has shown how Central and Eastern Europe was gradually sorted into national communities out of a welter of more fluid and overlapping identities. But this is not only true of nations. It had to be sorted into states, too. In the decades after 1848, the Habsburg Empire tried out different versions of that sorting in a series of constitutional orders, culminating, of course, in the Ausgleich, or the settlement of 1867, which transformed the empire into two separate and equally sovereign halves. So it converted the logic of composite monarchy into a new bifurcated sovereignty, a hyphenated state formation called the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Had sovereignty been doubled or divided? How could a state be two and somehow always one? The historian R.W. Seton Watson later quipped that the dualist theory is almost as theological as the doctrine of the Trinity. These constitutional experiments formed part of a much broader story of sovereign self-consciousness and imperial codification. A new self-consciousness about sovereign status and inter-imperial competition then spurred projects of codification and rationalization in the Blue Water and continental empires alike. Perhaps most notably in the reorganization and codification that's a craze that sort of swept across the Ottoman, Russian, Japanese, and Habsburg empires alike in the 1860s. There's an interesting global story there. All these polities felt similar pressures to articulate and assert their sovereignty in mutually recognizable ways. Through this process, sovereignty became the lens for new maps of the world, a prism for demarcating and comparing self and other, and for analyzing and regulating the interstate community. In their re-articulations of Habsburg sovereignty, Central European actors located themselves in these new maps of the world. Unsatisfied with the available terminology, Georg Jelinek coined the concept of state fragments, or Staatsfragmente, to capture an in-between level between a state on one hand and a province on the other. Some political formations, he argued, were subordinate under a state government, but not fully merged with that state. not states themselves, they presented the rudiments of a state, right? So this is a place in which people start thinking about things like the rudiments of the state or a fragment of a state. This is a genre of quasi-sovereignty captured by the ambiguous status of the Austrian lands, he thought, but also the settler colonies of Australia and Canada, he also grouped within this category, which likewise possessed state organs, though not full independence. So concepts like these rearranged the map of the world into sort of unfamiliar groupings. Small wonder that the Habsburg gallery of constitutional experiments echoed and travelled, especially for those dissatisfied with the unitary state. Austro-Hungarian Marxist proposals for the legal personality of national communities had afterlives in the Soviet Union, as well as the League of Nations interwar minorities regime, and later still in the political theory of multiculturalism. Habsburg layered sovereignty and dual-track administration shaped the thought of Austrian economists like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, who transposed that schema upward when they conceived of international economic governance as a stratum lying atop and bracketed from state sovereignty. The model of the 1867 settlement, in which two states might be fully sovereign and independent, yet still somehow looped together, was discussed by Ottoman intellectuals as a model for Egypt, by Irish nationalists as a template for their autonomy, and on the subcontinent as the partition of India and Pakistan loomed. Right? There was actually a huge appetite for these sorts of creative reconceptualizations of all the things a state might be. Here I'd like to draw out one central feature of these constitutional debates and restructurings. Seeking greater regional autonomy, claim makers from the lands appealed to their old rights and prerogatives, right? So the historic rights of the Kingdom of Bohemia or the Kingdom of Hungary. Originally, these had been essentially feudal rights, the feudal rights of the estates, and especially the aristocracy, that the monarch pledged to uphold as he acquired these principalities over the course of the early modern period. Right, this is the logic of composite monarchy, where a monarch would acquire a new land, but actually leave that land intact, because essentially it was on the basis of the laws of that polity that they were elected and crowned, and so those polities remained themselves inside this larger new imperial formation. Now, in the very different world of the 19th century, they reimagined these traditional patrimonial rights and privileges as the rights of states. States that had been sovereign, they now said, prior to Habsburg rule, and that had never formally renounced that status. And they pointed to the long string of coronation oaths and other dynastic agreements in which the Habsburg monarchs had always affirmed these traditional rights, right, always paid deference to them. But these claims obviously faced some rather serious evidentiary headaches, right? They had to explain how these historical lands still existed as quasi-sovereign states despite centuries of Habsburg rule and the material reality of a relatively centralized state. So politicians from Hungary and Bohemia and elsewhere got quite creative. They argued that historical rights remained good, legitimate law despite, or especially when, the Habsburgs failed to respect it. Valid law, they argued, could not be overridden by mere facts. Polities could persist as legal norms, pieces of suspended legitimacy awaiting renewed recognition and the restoration of full factual life. As the French scholar Louis Eisenman put it in his 1904 study, for centuries, Hungary has lived a double existence, one in reality, another in its laws. These laws had preserved the legal fiction of its sovereignty. It is the legal fiction which the laws of 1867 have turned into a reality, unquote. So this discourse about the nature of sovereignty in the Habsburg Empire involved a conception of statehood that could hover between fiction and reality, because sovereignty had never been formally ceded or legitimately overridden. According to these arguments, the empire contained a collection of slumbering states, suspended states, swallowed up but not dissolved in the python of empire. This is how Karol Kramář, Czechoslovakia's first prime minister, put it in discussing the centralizing reforms of Maria Theresa in the 18th century. As he wrote, and because she was formally and materially in the wrong, she could produce only a fact, but not a law. And for that reason, the rights of the Bohemian crown, the Bohemian Staatsrecht, the right to the unity and inseparability of the lands of the Bohemian crown, to their legislative and administrative independence and autonomy, is not abrogated, but rather persists wholly and completely in law. A law, although it may be effectively withdrawn from practice, can never be abrogated by a fact, even if it, i.e. the fact, is a piece of legislation. That is the immovable legal basis of the Bohemian Staatsrecht. Unquote. So in recent times, our interest in paper states or fictional states or juridical states has gravitated towards different parts of the colonial and post-colonial world. It can be easy to forget that modern European history is likewise littered with juridical states, states with a life primarily in law. The survival of various forms of slumbering and suspended sovereignty within empire, and the path of these semi-sovereign entities into a post-imperial age allows us to connect Central European history to parallel processes elsewhere, whether we look to the Indian princely states, once dubbed hollow crowns and theatre states by the anthropologist Nicholas Dirks, to the autonomous provinces of the Ottoman Empire, or to myriad other cases. Okay, to move to the end of the empire and the sort of second half of this book, which looks at what happened to this very vivid world of thinking and ordering when the empire collapsed. So as we all know, in 1918, the empire dissolved under the pressure of 4 years of total war. The First World War and the imperial dissolutions at its conclusion represented a multi-sided crisis of legitimacy. The shock of state collapse and the vacuums left in its wake required an immense intellectual mobilization in pursuit of orientation, sense, order, legitimacy. This crisis was especially acute for law. Why? In our modern positivist understanding of law, law is made by the state and enforced by the state. The state anchors the legal order. A state's collapse thus threatened law's collapse. How could states just end and start? Where did the law's validity come from? What lay behind the first law? How could a small band of mortal men gather in a room, call themselves a constituent assembly, and make sounds with their mouths and scribble shapes with their pens that ostensibly carried the weight and force of binding law? There was no emperor now, clad in robes and crowns, the wearable vessels of an age-old legitimacy, accumulated over centuries and connected somewhere in the deep mists of time to divine sanction. No props or smokescreens for the majesty of sovereignty, that presumed fount of man-made law. Sovereignty, that is, had nowhere to hide. All those questions about the ultimate basis of law, about the nature of the state, stared everyone nakedly in the face. As representatives from the new states, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Austria turned up to present their claims on the world stage, in the first instance at the Paris Peace Conference, they had to find ways of legally explaining what had happened and legally justifying the new states and their territorial claims. This work had already begun in the last phases of the war. In my work abroad, the Czech leader Thomas Masaryk explained, I was always careful to cast our political program in a juridical form, since I had in mind the legal and international problems that would arise at the peace conference. He understood that careful attention needed to be given not only to the de facto emergence of the Czechoslovak state, but also to the circumstances that gave it de jure, formal, legal, lawful existence. That is to say, how our historical and natural right to an independent state was recognized by the Allies and afterwards by the Central Powers, and how our revolution abroad and at home was legalized. So he understood all too well that an appeal to sort of airy natural rights, like the right to self-determination, was actually not sufficient, for several reasons. The legal status of such a revolutionary right remained very ambiguous, and the victorious allies, with their own empires to think about, were hardly going to endorse it as a universal entitlement. Moreover, self-determination could not carry the load of legitimation alone, also because the region's intermingled populations meant that all such claims would be territorially overlapping. So representatives from Czechoslovakia and Hungary did something else instead. Highly conscious of the fraught nature of conjuring these new sovereigns, they emphasized that no such juridical magic was necessary in the case at hand. This was not the spooky mystery of the emergence of a legal something out of a legal nothing. On the contrary, they argued that their states already existed in law. So they reused arguments they had developed in the framework of imperial constitutional law to legitimize these new states. So they now argued that with the collapse of Habsburg rule, these sleeping states simply reawakened, re-emerged from a long slumber into full sovereignty and international standing, with imperial rule merely an interregnum, a factual interruption of several hundred years. As Masaryk put it, starting from the historical rights of the lands of the Bohemian crown, which entitled us to the complete restoration of our state, I explained that, de jure, our state had never ceased to exist. The Czech state already existed in law, it simply needed to be revived into full material life. Our state, in fact, has never lost its continuity of rights. Hungarian statesmen use the same arguments. In the argument of the Hungarian delegation to the peace conference, they assert, we wish first of all to establish the fact that Hungary is no new state born of the dismemberment of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. As far as public law is concerned, the Hungary of today is the same state that she has been through her past of 1,000 years. She kept her position as an independent state on entering into a union with Austria and during the whole existence of the union known by the name of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. So in these sorts of arguments, 1918 represented a return to a deep pre-imperial status quo rather than a revolutionary rupture. States were, according to these arguments, extremely hard to kill in law. Political arguments developed in the framework of imperial constitutional debate were thus scaled up from imperial to international law, redirected from Vienna to Paris, by paying close attention to the legal language and the legal narratives used to explain the end of imperial sovereignty and the emergence of new states in its wake. My book recovers an unfamiliar story about the afterlives of imperial constitutional law in the interwar international order. In so doing, it also places Central Europe at the head of one of the 20th century's signal stories, because in subsequent decades, state natality and mortality was about to become a global mass phenomenon as decolonization remade the map of the world in the decades after World War II. Contemporaries spoke of an explosion of new states. In 1920, there had been just 42 member states of the League of Nations. In 1950, the United Nations had 60. But in 1960, it had 99, and in 1990, 159. I think we're only just beginning to grapple with the significance of this transformation for the world of ideas. I think we have only so far the beginnings of an intellectual history of decolonization. And in thinking forward from this earlier round of imperial dissolution, an unfamiliar story about the justification of new sovereignty emerges into view. Because those legal stories about sovereignty suspended and resurrected, surviving empire and coming out the other side, now morphed into scripts for international legal politics around the globe. An enormous new jurisprudence on the idea of old and new states emerged into view. Jurists from India, from Indonesia, from Algeria, and elsewhere rejected the idea that their states were new, with its connotations of conditionality and contingency. They too argued that their polities reverted to a sovereignty they had held prior to colonial rule. Ram Prakash Anand, one of India's most important international jurists in this period, and a key protagonist in struggles over decolonization, put it like this. Colonization during the 18th and 19th centuries eclipsed rather than extinguished the international legal personality of the colonized countries. To recall earlier sovereignty was to relativize colonialism in time. To quote him again, in international law, the term colonization merely meant temporary legal incapacity of the once sovereign actors. Or in the words of Upendra Baxi, another very interesting legal thinker from this time and place, as he put it, from the perspective of human history, the colonial epoch can be regarded as being no more than a brief interlude in the historical life of colonized nations. So with suspended sovereignty now revived, post-colonial states rejoin the international legal community along this line of argumentation, not as juvenile newcomers, but as equals. Right? That's the sort of speech act of these sorts of claims that says, we've been here all along, we don't need your condescension or your good favor to emerge as your equals now on the world stage. So this story involves figures moving between these cases, right, moving between the theatres in which this story plays out. For example, I spend some time reconstructing the trajectory of Charles Alexandrovitz, who was born in 1902 in Habsburg, Lemberg, Lvov, whose circuitous career took him from interwar Poland to London, where he worked for the Polish government in exile during World War II, and then to Madras, where he was a professor of law. There in India, in the immediate aftermath of independence, and in close contact with Indian jurists and archives, he developed the influential reversion to sovereignty thesis, arguing that the sovereignty of post-colonial states like India and Sri Lanka was not new, contingent, qualified, but they instead reverted back to the full degree of sovereignty they had enjoyed prior to colonial rule. So the very final section of the book traces how these themes, how these themes returned to Europe in the 1990s in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. As the USSR, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia came apart, and as the two Germanys merged back together, the question of the birth, death, and continuity of states roared back into the center of European political life. Once again, one asked if states were old or if they were new. One asked if states had ceased or if they had survived. One asked if sovereignty, once lapsed, could be resurrected. One argued over whether the Russian Federation was the legal continuator, as the ugly term that was used, of the USSR, inclusive of its seat on the UN Security Council. Right, a lot of things are at stake in these sorts of very abstract propositions because, it's got this seat on the Security Council. If it ceased to be a legal entity, what happens to that whole position, right? Does it have to reapply for membership? Would it still have that position on the Security Council, et cetera, et cetera? Whether the Baltic states really were, as they claimed, the legal resurrections of their interwar selves, right? That's an argument they actually managed to land, that they pick up sovereignty where they had lost it in 1940 with the Soviet occupation. So in charting this arc, I'm very interested in the relationship between regional experiences and the evolution of international law, and how regional particularities get coded into ideas and theories. So, if in the era of the two world wars, state birth and death had seemed like especially Central European pathology, right? Because with the Nazi occupations of Austria and Czechoslovakia, we have another round of these questions after the Second World War. And so when people are writing about it in that mid-century moment, it's like, these Central European states have broken and begun and ceased all over again. So it seems like a real Central European thing. But then, of course, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, it conversely appeared as a quintessential condition of the post-colonial world. Jurists like the Algerian Mohammed Bajawi doubted whether rules developed in Europe could be usually applied to the global south, right? And he has a very interesting career at the International Law Commission, arguing that we need a complete new law of state succession that reflects post-colonial realities, not these older European legal norms. But then in the 1990s, the reverse happened, and jurists wondered whether a body of law, that is the law of state succession, that was now so associated with these post-colonial states, could be appropriately brought back to Europe. Right, so we have this ostensibly universal international legal order that's struggling with the movement of these problems between different parts of the world and how to think about these states together under the same concepts. So these images of sovereignty lost and found continue to echo today in ongoing struggles over indigenous rights, especially in settler colonies, a current frontier of debates about decolonization and self-determination. To take the case of Australia, which is one that lies close to my heart, we can take the words, for example, of Irene Watson, an important Indigenous Australian law professor and activist, as she says, we continue to challenge the idea that somewhere we have lost our international juridical status as nations and peoples. Aboriginal peoples, she writes, come to international law as pre-existing, already formed, and arrived entities, right? Again, it's like we were here first, actually. We do not need to create new international legal selves now. In its work on Indigenous rights in the 1990s, the UN's Commission on Human Rights agreed. Of those Indigenous peoples seeking the juridical status of nations, I quote them, it must be presumed until proven otherwise that they continue to enjoy such status. Meanwhile, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which was a major proposal for constitutional reform in Australia, holds that the ancient sovereignty of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples was never ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. In this example, the time shrinking of imperial rule and the time expansion of original sovereignty take on monumental new proportions. How could it be otherwise, asks the Uluru Statement, that peoples possessed a land for 60 millennia and this sacred link disappears from world history merely in the last 200 years? Thank you.
So we promised to have a conversation, which after this tour de force is not easy because it's. So I will try to keep this somewhat light.
I'm sorry.
No, I'm serious. No. Because I mean, there's something to the structure of the argument that you're presenting, which is incredibly far-reaching and ambitious. That is. Astonishingly flattering to our part of the world, and it recalls moves like Karl Schorska's and Richard Crockett more recently, that sort of everything that is not even good or just is important in the world originates from here, which we are quite amenable to entertaining. But the question, and it's interesting because I wasn't when I noticed that the book is transformation and the talk is birth. Now I realize that's quite an issue. Because, I mean, a different reading, and I'm sure I'm not the first one to ask you this, is to argue that these individual moments of performative legal presentation of quasi or aspirationally state selves is totally contingent, and that actors say the kinds of things and write the kinds of things that they think will further their political causes, and that there are clearly similarities in the arguments made across time, but why should we assume that there is a kind of organic or intellectual link between them? So, maybe it's independent invention, right? When you're a decolonizing state in the 50s, you make an argument that kind of, will legitimate you, just like they did in the 20s.
Absolutely. I mean, this book doesn't posit that sort of strong continuity. It doesn't say these arguments only happen because of the Habsburg example. No, the claim is in some ways more modest than that. I want to argue that we can see these claims surfacing here, in some ways for the first time,
so we were
meaningfully.
First. Okay. It's not that everyone took it from us. We were just the first. Okay.
Well, and even there, but it's the scale of, of course you might have sort of individual examples before, but the point is that everyone has to debate these questions in 1918. So, I have fascinating stuff from the back rooms of the Paris Peace Conference, where the British delegation are all, very up in arms about these Hungarian and these Austrian arguments, and they are having to try and figure it out. You know what I mean, and make a sort of general principle, and it sort of shows the extent to which no one knows actually really what sort of body of law. And so my argument is that begins as this international legal conversation in this moment. But to your earlier point, because I think it's important, law is instrumental. Absolutely. You know what I mean? This is not to take law out of politics, it's to insert law into politics. And so, law is a way of making a claim that you hope will have will win results. You know what I mean? It is a sort of intellectual argumentation that has, power, or at least consequence as its goal. And so that doesn't make it intellectually any less interesting. I mean, in some ways I feel like I was sort of drawn to legal history because it seemed to be this place where, you could do intellectual history but have an answer to the kind of who cares question, because legal arguments do often have such real world consequences.
I'm totally intrigued by that very proposition, because I mean, this is obviously a huge conceptual methodological argument about, about law in general, and this is a big debate of, to what degree it is constitutive and to what degree it is reflective.
Yes.
I mean, I have the advantage that I spent the entire afternoon reading the book, so
I'm sorry.
No, on the contrary. No, because, so it's totally fresh in my mind that one of the most astonishing moments, and you gave us a big part of it, is of course 1919.
Yes.
What happens in Paris, and so the Bohemians, Masaryk and Beneš,
Yes.
so what becomes Czechoslovakia, they make an argument about the Kingdom of Bohemia, eternal, and the temporary. The Hungarians do the same. The Austrians do the opposite.
I know, it's wonderful.
But they do it because it makes sense.
Exactly.
I mean, of course they don't want to be the continuity state.
Exactly. So
because that would suck. So.
Exactly.
So they're inventing something out of whole cloth, and then they don't like what they see because it's nothing. Like it's a little Nevishy country, which we still have, and so they're unhappy.
No, to bring you all in a little bit here, it is amazing. So yeah, the Hungarians and the Bohemians, they're all turning up in Paris to establish these long, forever existing states, and there's sort of the idea of reversion to rights and so on, which is very important for them. Why? For multiple reasons, but of course for territory, right? Czechoslovakia wants its historic borders, in the West that includes a huge number of Germans who themselves are claiming self-determination and wanting to join Germany, which the Allies aren't going to allow, right? And Hungary, of course, is very keen to try and preserve its historic boundaries, most of which, it loses. It loses, 2/3 of its territory. But there you've got the Austrians, ostensibly, the bearers of this state tradition, turning up and saying, oh, no, we're a totally new state. Nothing to do with that thing that was here before. Because they don't want to get saddled with all of the debts and legal obligations, or at least they want to share them. That they raise actually very legally sound questions, like on what basis we've changed our form of government, we have these radical new borders, there's no actual structural similarity in our population or anything. On what basis can you make this post-war Republic in Austria the legal inheritor of the empire? And it's not a question that there are very good answers to. And so again, this produces this sort of philosophical conversation.
But as if that was not fascinating enough, the person making this argument is Kelsen. Mr. Systematic Purist of Law is making a completely contingent argument that is entirely strategic.
No, and it's one of the things I really want to do in this book is bring Kelsen into the world. I, like so many people, had this experience picking him up for the first time, just thinking, gosh, what is this? This is so cold and abstract, and there is nowhere to get into it. There's no rough edges, no sort of doors or windows. But then was sort of forced in. As I was trying to turn my dissertation into a book to try and go into it a little bit. He was obviously a rather important figure, in these. And then it's, of course, like anything like this, once you actually put the time into it and suddenly it begins to open to you, I realized not only, how extraordinarily interesting it was, but precisely that abstraction as a political strategy suddenly was filled with so much pathos, right? And I wanted to bring that story of him as actually, quite desperately grasping towards a way of making the world make sense. Yes. That's a very human sort of struggle, one that we can all relate to now. And so to sort of explain why he came to those sorts of intellectual strategies for managing that radical uncertainty.
Let me end with the question that has puzzled me, and you're the one who can answer it, that has puzzled me for a long time, because I'm not a legal scholar and legal philosophy confuses me. But I have never been able to fathom how this very brilliant creator of positivist legal philosophy is also the writer of our very conventional constitution. Mm-hmm. And no? In its conventionality. It's like the constitution of every other country. So I'm trying to understand. I've long tried to understand. We're so proud that Kelsen wrote our constitution. It strikes me as a total amateur, but you're the professional, that the Kelsen who wrote the constitution was the Kelsen who argued strategically for Austrian non-continuity in Paris, and was quite a different Kelsen from the theoretician and philosopher that he also was. Yes. So like the jurist's two bodies.
5, 10 bodies. This is actually one of the amazing things about Curzon. Like in his legal scholarship, he preaches this radical separation of the disciplines, right? That, law cannot be dealing with morality, or with politics, or philosophy. And so it seems so sort of, again, austere and as though he's just actually really boring. But it turns out that, he writes about Aristotle and love. He writes about Freud and dreams. He's actually this extremely broad thinker, but all of those things are for him different sorts of inquiries. He's not got his lawyerly hat on when he's doing that, and so I actually, in doing a little bit of armchair psychoanalyzing, sort of like talk about the violence upon the self that this sort of compartmentalization requires. And he, in his early work, in a preface there, you get some little, skerrick, some little like fragments of him sort of acknowledging that, like, because he has some line there at some point where he's like, I don't like this, but I can find no other way to make it make sense. And that the sort of dilemma, he's actually, I think, is sort of almost like depressed about that monism, like about that radical separation as he's sort of coming to it. But the fact that because that's the only logical solution he can find, that means he's going to do it. You think about the discipline that requires, but also the sort of intellectual ambition. This is something that really strikes me when I read these characters, and it's not only him, it's Freud and all these characters who were developing total philosophies, right? They wanted to find a way to make the whole make sense. They're so much more ambitious than us. We write a little argument about this. It doesn't matter that it doesn't cook up with this other thing that we also believe in, or that with this other philosophy that someone else generated. We're quite happy for a sort of, it all not to actually add up, and for there to be all kinds of inconsistencies in the world. And maybe that's an accurate reflection of the world as it is. But the characters of this era, they weren't content with that. They were reaching for something much larger, and we might argue that it drove them into sort of crazy positions. But there is something actually sort of breathtaking and humbling and inspiring about their efforts.
You've convinced me. No. I mean, Curzon is fascinating, and thank you so much for this talk, but especially for your scholarship and again reminding us why Vienna is the most important city in the world.
Absolutely, without question.
Thank you for coming, and please stay for coffee or drinks at the cafe. There is a book table outside. Natasha will be signing books if people would like. I certainly recommend it.
Thank you
so much for coming.